Thank you all for coming. My name is Vinny Valdez, and I'm with Red Hat Consulting. I'm in a special group called, we're very special, we're called the Global Solutions and Strategy Office. And we work with primarily our internal groups, engineering, other consultants, SAs, support, and other internal groups. And what we do is we develop these solutions based on our products that are tailored for our customers. And the goal of these solutions is for our consultants and for other partners to go out and deliver them.
And I'm James Labocki. I'm from the Cloud Solutions team at Red Hat. So we're also special, not as special as Vinny's team, but we work with all the product teams at Red Hat to figure out how these products come together to solve specific use cases. So how do they integrate? So we'll be sharing a little bit of that today. So that's
Okay, so why are we here? Obviously, the title implies that we're going to be talking about best practices, but there's a problem with that.
Best practices are boring, right? Would you agree? Nobody comes. I'm surprised there's this many people with the title of
really
best practices.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
They're boring unless you can tie real-world use cases to them, and that's what we want to do today. So. James has a number of demos that he has recorded. Some of you, has anybody seen those before?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, a couple of people. Good. So James will walk through those. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our best practices around deployments. And hopefully, you guys will leave with a good idea of some of the best practices for deploying these and some real-world use cases and how you may want to implement this in your enterprise. So we'll start out talking about deployment. Then we'll look at extending that deployment to cover an architecture of multiple, let's say, regions. And we'll look at how to replicate that up to a master database. We'll look at some of the best practices around how to back up and recover your databases. And we'll go a little bit further and talk about, once you get into some of the components, we'll talk about how to export and even import some of those policies and other data so that you can save those and back those up as well. And we're going to call that our care and feeding section. And then we'll look at OpenShift Enterprise.
Yep. So how many of you guys attended any sessions on OpenShift Enterprise? OK. How many of you have attended any sessions on CloudForms? OK, cool. So what we'll do is we'll look at a couple of best practices for CloudForms Management Engine with regards to how to do automated provisioning of OpenShift Enterprise. So OpenShift Enterprise is going to be our example workload, but the concepts of the workload can be kind of made generic for other workloads. So whether this is a Tomcat application or a OLTP database or something like that, the concepts can be kind of made generic. So we'll talk about automated provisioning of OpenShift Enterprise. Then we'll talk about deploying applications in OpenShift Enterprise. So this will take a look at how do you extend some of the functionality of CloudForms Management Engine to be able to deploy generic services. And then finally, we'll talk about actually being able to scale OpenShift Enterprise. So how do you dynamically scale a workload based on policy? Again, OpenShift Enterprise just being the example, and you being able to take these concepts and use them for any other workload as well. So real quick, just to level set everybody, because we know you've got probably a lot of different folks in the room on what CloudForms exactly is and what OpenShift is and how they kind of play in the portfolio. So CloudForms is Red Hat's open hybrid cloud management framework. And what it allows you to do is have a choice of infrastructure that you can manage. So whether those are clouds, such as Amazon EC2, or virtual infrastructure providers, such as Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization or VMware vSphere, you can choose the infrastructure. And how many of you were in the roadmap session or for CloudForms Management Engine? OK, so you heard OpenStack's coming as well, right? So that's more of the cloud model, right, as opposed to the virtual infrastructure model. And it allows it's built with an adaptive management platform, meaning that all these capabilities you see in the middle here, insight, control, automate, and integrate, those capabilities are built adaptively, so new providers can get plugged in very easily, and all those functionalities that are built on top of them can be utilized without having to rework the entire system. So those capabilities and how they break down are insight, control, automate, and integrate. So insight is really about discovery and monitoring of the environment, so basically finding out what you have. Control is about then being able to take the policies, build policies around what you've discovered. So for example, making sure that a workload that's tagged as a certain type of workload doesn't move onto a certain host or provider, or checking the compliance of a specific virtual machine. And then finally, automate allows you to take those control policies and actually perform specific automation actions based on those. So if someone turns on a Windows virtual machine and it's not at a specific patch level, or even if it is, you may want to shut that virtual machine down.
Yeah, what's really nice about this is they build on each other. So once you can take advantage of the Insight module and gather that information, you then have all that metadata in your database, and we'll talk about some of these a little bit later. But then you now have the ability to look at that data and make specific decisions and actions, and that's where control comes in. And then you can, as James mentioned, take those control policies and extend those out into Automate for more flexibility. So it's really important to understand how these all build on each other.
Yeah. And then the last piece of this, just before we go, is integrate, which is the web services API available. So if you want to plug in a third-party system to call this and perform those automate actions, or take advantage of any of that, you can. And then all that's available through a single pane of glass to all those users at the top. So whether it's a self-service user who just cares about serving up virtual machines, or a self-service user who cares about serving up a service or a collection of VMs, or if it's a manager or a sysadmin, you could give all those kind of views to that user.
Thank you. OK, so now we're going to talk just a little bit about OpenShift and what it is, since we are using this as our example workload. As James mentioned, you could use pretty much any workload. We just thought this would be a nice combination to talk about. So OpenShift is our platform as a service offering. We have a specific product called OpenShift Enterprise. And we actually are hosting a lab right now, a hands-on lab, in which about 80 students are going through those. And it's going on right now. I was a part of that just before coming over here. And we have a lot of interest, a lot of great questions from both system administrators and developers. The idea behind OpenShift is that rather than following the typical deployment model or development model of taking a single virtual machine, dedicating it for an application use for a developer to develop and test, and then eventually go to production, and then say they want application number 2 that they want to develop, then they get another virtual machine. Anybody who's gone through that process knows it's obviously more streamlined and better than going through the process of procuring hardware. So sure, it is a lot better. But OpenShift takes that one step further. So you actually take a single, could be virtual machine, could be bare metal. In fact, it ends up that OpenShift doesn't care. It just wants to be running on RHEL. And you actually slice that up using SE Linux and PAM namespaces and some other technology, C groups, to provide a true multi-tenancy environment for your applications. So rather than having to spin up additional virtual machines and use additional capacity that may not all be used, you can now slice that up with OpenShift and quickly start applications up. So what this means from a practical standpoint, a developer can come to the user interface or via CLI, or we'll see how we can integrate that with CloudForms management engine. But in the end, you say, I want a Ruby application. And it creates it, and you're ready to go. And you have a Git repository built in, and you start coding, and you're ready to go.
Great. So just in the context of the broader portfolio, so you see where these pieces fit. So this is kind of Red Hat's view of the architecture of cloud computing. So you've got, on the left-hand side, you've got the business consumer coming in, consuming either PaaS or infrastructure as a service. And that is basically the PaaS running on infrastructure. There's a cloud brokering piece that's managing virtual resources, public cloud resources, or physical resources. And then on the right is where you have the management side, where managers are coming in and they're expecting things such as lifecycle management, service management, all those functionalities here. So again, Red Hat obviously has a strong view of that the future is really an open hybrid cloud. So while we have pieces of the portfolio that fit over all this, the idea is that you don't have to use the entire portfolio, right? You can mix and match different components. So just to give you an idea there. So with that, I'll turn over to Vinny on some of the kickoff into the best practices.
OK. So I'm going to walk through just sort of the typical scenario that generally a system administrator would go through to deploy CloudForms management engine. So the first thing you do is want to obtain the appliance. So that's one of the key things is in the way that we deliver CloudForms management engine is that it's an appliance. So it's completely prepackaged and ready to go. So you don't have to install an OS. You don't have to install any packages. The appliance is ready to go with all of the proper disks and everything just attached and ready. And so if you go to the customer portal, you'll find that there are You can first go under the RHEL 5 channel, 64-bit. That's what the current appliance is based on. And you'll just look for Red Hat CloudForms Management Engine, version 5.1. That, as of today, as of now, that is the current version. You'll see that there is a zip file for deploying this into a VMware environment, which contains an OVF for VMware. And then there's a separate download, which is the OVF for the Rev environment. So the process would involve, on the VMware side, you would just go to vCenter and you deploy the OVF template. You point to where that download was. And you'll be prompted to start the VM if you wanted, if anybody who's used vCenter may be familiar with that process. What we recommend as a best practice is that you actually don't start that VM at that point. You let that import finish, and then you create a template based on that. And then what you may want to do is customize that template. Maybe you have some third-party software that's required for your enterprise environment, or there's something else that you need to specialize. You can go ahead and do that at that time, and then create, seal up that template again. And the reason for that, we'll see a little bit later, is that you want the ability to quickly bring up additional appliances based on that template, and deploy those into what we'll see are zones and regions. On the Rev side, you're going to do a similar process, but it's a little bit different. There is a tool that you could use on RevM called RevM Image Uploader. Or you could manually go to the NFS storage, if you have access to it, and take that OVF and untart it directly onto the images directory of the Rev export domain. So anybody who's familiar with that will understand what that means. The Rev export domain is an NFS share, and it's used to import and export virtual machines and images into and out of the environment. So similarly, you would want to import, once that is into the export domain, you want to import it as a template, and then similarly, make any customizations that you need, and it is now ready to be deployed as a VM from that template. So whether you're on vCenter or RevM, the next step would be create your virtual machine from that template. And as I said, it's an appliance. It's ready to go. It's configured for DHCP out of the box. And in fact, the appliances have the appropriate agents. So for vCenter, it'll have the VMware agent on it. And for the Rev appliance, it'll have the Rev agent on there. So what that means is you just look at your management interface, and you can get whatever the IP is, or you can just launch the console and see what that IP is and grab that. And you're done at that point. Now, there are some additional things you can do from the actual console. You can manage it, but largely, you can just hit the IP from a web browser and start configuring it. And so that would be the next step. There are multiple ways that you can configure your authentication. You can use the basic authentication built in, but more likely, you're going to want to integrate it with something in your environment, like an LDAP or maybe Active Directory, something like that. So you'd want to do that. Then you want to map the groups over to your CloudForms Management Engine interface so that you can assign roles to the different users that will be coming in based on their groups. Then the next thing would be the server roles. So these are what determine what that CloudForm, that specific virtual machine is going to be performing, what activities. So by default, there are a number of roles enabled. For example, the WebUI, so that you can hit the WebUI. The database role will be enabled, so any CloudForms VM that comes up also has its database, and it has the database role enabled. And we'll see a little bit later that when you're bringing up additional CloudForms VMs, you're going to want to customize those roles. For example, if you have an existing database and you want to bring up an additional CloudForms VM and put it in the same zone or region, you don't want it to also run a database. So you want to uncheck that role, for example, and point it to the existing database, just as a small example. The next thing would be classification taxonomy. So this is about creating tag categories. For example, you can have a department, and it would be the category, and your tags might be HR or finance. And you'll find that there's actually a number of tags provided out of the box, which are very useful, and you could actually just start using those. But we do recommend taking some time and understanding what your environment is going to be, what your use of these tags will be. Tags are very, very powerful.
Yeah.
You'll find that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it can't be understated. How important it is to think about the taxonomy you're going to use before you start implementing CloudForms Management Engine. Tags actually drive a lot of the functionality inside the product. So as you install new hypervisors, or as you spin up new virtual machines, or even if virtual machines are spun up outside of the purview of CloudForms Management Engine, all the discovery that takes place can apply these categories and tags to that environment. So when the discovery takes place, let's say you spin up a new virtual machine and it has Postgres installed on it, CloudForms Management Engine can look at that without agents on that system, can determine that that package is on there, and then it can go ahead and tag that system as a database. And then now you start to get all that goodness of tagging, where when a DBA logs in, he only sees a certain viewpoint, and when an operations person comes in, they see a different viewpoint of tags. So really powerful.
Very great. And then we mentioned the Insight module earlier. So we have all this data about your environment, all this metadata. So the next thing you'd want to do is create some reports. So there are a number of reports available out of the box, and a number of those reports will be presented in a dashboard, and we'll see that later when we look at the demo. But it's going to be important that you present the proper reports to your environment, to what the executives or management want to see. So you can pretty much create reports out of any data that you've collected. So that's sort of the next step. You want to create your reports and then create dashboards out of those reports. Then we'll look at self-service provisioning so that users can come to the portal, to the UI of CloudForms Management Engine and request a machine or a VM, or as we'll see later, groups of virtual machines, which we call service catalogs. So that's sort of the next thing it will do. And then lastly, we'll configure our policies. And when you get into the details of the policies, you'll find out that they're composed of events. So a policy is kicked off by some kind of event. Event can be a VM is started, or it's shut down, or something has happened. There's a number of events that you can select from. And then there's a condition that you would check to determine if you want to continue. So you can think of it as sort of an if-then statement. So if this condition is true, then you would perform an action. So there's an event, a condition, and an action. And then you can also do an else. So if the condition is not true, it'll perform something else, like an action. Now, your action can be to send an alert, or it can be to perform an action such as shut down a VM. So a simple practical example might be, I want to look up the metadata I've collected. I want to determine when the event happens that a virtual machine starts up. I want to check something. For example, I want to check sshd_config. Do they permit root login? Yes. OK, so that's the condition. So the action could be shut down the VM. So what that means is I'm not allowing a Linux machine. And there's something along the same lines of a condition called a scope. So you can check something very quickly before you go into the actual condition. So before looking at the metadata, you may want to say, is it a Linux machine? So if it's Windows, you're obviously not going to find an sshd config file. So a little bit more detail we don't need to go into, but that's an example there. And what's really nice about that is if a user reaches around behind Management Engine, goes directly to vCenter or Rev and tries to start that VM up, CloudForms Management Engine will see that and deny that and execute the action of shutting down the VM. So policies are very powerful. Another action could be send an alert. So you can send an SNMP trap or an email. And then lastly, you can actually send, as an action, you can send that over to Automate, and then you can do some additional things, which James will talk about. OK, so this here just a very, very simple diagram. It talks about a typical single region architecture. Now, these are very, very simple and simplistic on purpose just to get the concepts across. There's obviously a lot more detail that goes on behind the scenes. But what we're talking about here is a user is going to come in and is going to talk to, we're looking at this WebUI Zone, which is a group of CloudForms Management Engine systems. So here, this example just shows that there could be a couple of them. So these are servers that were deployed from the template that have had their roles specifically selected so that they're only a WebUI. So they're not running the database role at all. They're actually pointing over to the top right corner, which is a separate CloudForms Management Engine server that is running the database role. And it is the database for this region. And then down here, we see bottom left, we have a Rev environment. And we've sliced this up into a zone. And as an example, we're calling this Worker Zone 1. And so we have a couple of CloudForms Management Engine servers running there as well. Then we have a separate zone for vSphere. And this number down here, 301, is a rough estimate of what we recommend for a single zone. So 300 virtual machines to be managed by a single CloudForms Management Engine server.
Yeah. So the important thing here is that you could basically, by role, designate what these CloudForms Management Engines do, and then you could horizontally scale them for capacity. Yep. So if, for example, that user comes into the WebUI Zone, and provisions a virtual machine, requests a virtual machine be provisioned, that would create a task that would get dropped onto a request queue on the VMDB. And so those workers down in the bottom, worker zone 1 and worker zone 2, are monitoring that request queue. And when they see that, they know that the management system that they control or are tied to is in that same zone. So they would, for example, if they were provisioning to VMware, the task would get dropped on the queue, and the workers in zone 2 would look up and say, well, I'm responsible for provisioning. I have the automation engine role enabled, so I'm going to go ahead and pick up that job and provision the VMs onto the onto the vSphere environment.
Exactly. So that's a simple single region. And if we look, this is a little bit more complex, two-region architecture. So if you recall from the previous picture, this bottom left region here is exactly the same as it was in the previous picture. So it's this region now, which is part of a larger architecture. So we still have a Raleigh VMDB. By the way, that's our virtual machine database. So we have that single database. We still have the WebUI zone. We still have a user that's going to come into this specific zone to perform any provisioning requests. And then we still have our worker 1 and 2 zones with Rev and vSphere. But now we've added a second region. So this is Boston over there to the right. Similar layout, just for simplicity again. Of course, it would be different. But now what we've added is a master VMDB at the top. So these databases from these regions will actually replicate up. And then we have a separate WebUI zone again to handle all the top-level requests. So any manager, say somebody wants to see some reporting about the entire architecture, including all regions, they would come in at the top and be able to look at all the data that's been replicated up. And now any actions that take place, now technically you can from the top come in and start, stop, or suspend a VM. In other words, those commands can get pushed down. But technically you want to come into the region that you want to manage if you want to perform any activity or actions or self-provisioning, self-service provisioning. Okay. So next, best practice discussions would be around care and feeding. So I mentioned you want to set up some kind of backup schedule. So you can go to an individual server and back up the database directly from the UI, very, very simply. You can also schedule, which we recommend, schedule routine backups, and those can be offloaded to file servers. And you want to make sure that you have those, of course, if you have, put those into your normal backup schedule with whatever agents you use. Then we talked about policies. We talked about automation a little bit. James will go into detail. But when you make changes like that, those are kept in the database. But it is a good idea to go ahead and export those, especially if you're tweaking with the policies or automation model and you're making a lot of changes. There is a facility within the UI that lets you reset those, reset the automation model in case you've tweaked it a little bit too much and you need to start from scratch. So it is a good idea to do some exporting of that. And it exports as an XML file, so it's very easy to back up.
Yep. Cool.
And you can also turn around and import those. So if you backed it up, you made some changes, it didn't work the way you wanted, you can just re-import that.
Cool.
Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Vinny. So want to take it a step further and start looking at the provisioning process and some things you could do around provisioning a workload. So we'll start with OpenShift, the provisioning OpenShift Enterprise infrastructure. So within CloudForms itself, and we'll dive into the videos pretty quickly here, because I think it makes a lot more sense when you actually see it in action. There's a number of catalog item types. So a catalog item is something that you can author that you can then present to a self-service user and they can deploy on. So the catalog item types that are available today are Rev, vSphere, EC2, and generic. Okay, so Rev, vSphere, and EC2 catalog item types allow you to provision a virtual machine onto that provider. The generic type actually allows you to have basically a custom starting point that you define the method inside of Automate that you want to call. So for example, if all I wanted to do was open up a ticket in Remedy, right, through this UI, I could very easily create a generic service type and say open Remedy ticket. And then I can create an entry point into the Automate model that allows the user to fully manage the workflow of opening up a ticket in Remedy via the API. And this is some of the stuff you'll see in the product already when you go under integrations that already exist. There's a number of methods for provisioning the virtual machines themselves. So Rev, vSphere, and EC2 have different provisioning methods. But basically, they fall into kind of three categories. One is template-based provisioning. So you could provision a template that's sitting on the provider itself. CloudForms Management Engine will reach out, clone that template, and create a new VM out of it. There's ISO, which mounts an ISO to it and goes through the installation via ISO. If you're familiar with Red Hat Enterprise virtualization, you can do that as well. And then there's Pixie. So it will basically write the Pixie boot records and boot up a VM and manage that entire process. As far as customizing deployments, CloudForms Management Engine is about orchestration. It's not about configuration management directly. So it doesn't care what configuration management you want to use. If you want to use Puppet to configure after the fact, or Chef, or shell scripts, my favorite, no. You could use whatever you want. So what this ends up looking like, wow, that's not as bad eye chart as I thought it would be. The next one's really bad, I promise. All right. So on the right-hand side, you got basically numbered steps. So in this case, we've got a PaaS admin. So this is my platform as a service administrator. So let's say this is the OpenShift admin. He's going to come in, and what he wants to do is he wants to provision the infrastructure that OpenShift is running. So you can imagine this is also like a WebSphere system administrator, right? He wants to provision RHEL and WebSphere on it. In this case, we're talking OpenShift. So the PaaS admin comes to the CloudForms Management Engine. He says, please create me an OpenShift Broker or OpenShift node, either or. And what happens is CloudForms Management Engine will reach down into the virtualization provider, select a template, and use it to build a VM. Now, it's not actually using the OS in that template in this case, because we're doing Pixie provisioning. We'll just basically use the VM as the container. And then at the same time, it's writing a Pixie boot record to the Pixie server. And those you can actually add in multiple Pixie servers into CloudForms Management Engine, right? And kind of, if you want to federate a bunch of Pixie servers out there. So the VMs will get booted. They'll network boot. They'll build from satellite in this case. But again, that could be a generic Yum repo or a third-party system with all your content in it. But of course, you guys would all use satellite, right? And then the really nice thing is it'll actually register for ongoing updates. So next version of OpenShift Enterprise comes out or Errata comes out, you can actually then see those in satellite and update them. And then finally, at the end here, basically we're laying down using an activation key. We're just executing Puppet locally on the VMs. However, if you wanted to, say, register this to Foreman or Puppet Enterprise or anything else, you could do that as well. Again, we're just happen to use Puppet. So for a little in-depth look of what that Puppet module actually looks like, this is the eye chart. So Krishna in the OpenShift Origin community posted some really great Puppet modules for configuring OpenShift Origin. And so I basically took them and made them work for OpenShift Enterprise. And it's pretty simple, right? There's a site manifest that calls an init manifest. And those have all the specific manifests for each specific service. So for example, in this case, when a VM comes up and it executes, if we set the broker equal to true, it'll configure as a broker. If we set node equal to true, it'll come up as, it'll define the node as, it'll set the VM up as an OpenShift Enterprise node. And then it basically calls all these underlying services. So these are all the services you'd have to manually configure to install OpenShift Enterprise, right? Unless you're using like an image-based and you already have some sort of config management tool. And this is all automated for you. So let me give you a real quick demo.
Your sound off.
Oh, that's me. Oh, that's not going to work. So what we've got here is the CloudForms Management Engine. Now, this is before we rebranded it as CloudForms, so this is still the Manage IQ bits here. So 2 of my videos are like this, and then you'll see the reskinned appliance. So you'll get to appreciate the new look. Either that or it's because I was too lazy to recreate them. We'll stick with the former. So basically, when you go in, you'll notice that up at the top there's a menuing system, for those of you who haven't seen the UI before. But basically what I'm going to do is go in and provision a new virtual machine in here. And you do that by going up to the lifecycle button and hitting Provision VMs. So here I'm just going to select this template. So this is the example template I'm using. Again, this template that's sitting on Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization is just going to basically get thrown away, right? It's just going to use it for the VM construct, and then it's going to get rid of it. So this service dialog here is presented to the user. So imagine I'm an operations user going in to provision my OpenShift infrastructure. And here he can select the cost center. He could select the catalog. In this case, I'm going in and selecting the Pixie server that I want to use.
That previous screen, by the way, were tags.
Yep.
That's a nice use of tags.
And then here, I can select which environment I want to run in. So whether this is which host I want to run on or which cluster. In this case, I'm going to choose automatically. And CloudForms Management Engine will use best fit placement to determine what hosts to drop this workload onto. And that's completely customizable.
And again, based on tags. So you can tag hosts or groups, the user groups that are coming in. If they're tagged certain ways, that will determine where that gets auto-placed.
Yep. Again, in this case, I'm giving the option to select the hardware. All these service dialogs are completely customizable. So if you had a PaaS admin that was coming in, or let's say you had a WebSphere admin and you didn't want to give him any choice, you just wanted him to just be able to only put in his email address and nothing else, you could take all that away from him. Choose the VLAN that this is on. And finally, this is really the important part. So this is the customization screen. So you'll notice there's a number of customization templates down at the bottom. And I could select these. And these were basically customization templates I had created. So the first thing you need, who is paying attention in the OpenShift sessions? What do you need before you need a node? Anybody? You need a broker, right? Okay, so the broker controls the node and helps you deploy your application. So I'm going to deploy a broker first. So I select the OpenShift broker here. And then if I scroll down, basically, that's a kickstart file, right? So it's basically allowing me to use a kickstart file as what's called a customization template in CloudForms Management Engine. And so if I scroll down to the bottom of this CloudForms, this kickstart file, there's a couple things you'll notice. Am I playing this? Yeah. One is it's really long because I exported out of satellite. I didn't write that all by hand. And two is that, one, it's actually going to pull down and replace my etcrc local and just make this a local Puppet master. So I'm not like connecting to a Puppet enterprise system and deploying this. I'm just running Puppet locally on here. So next step is to get, actually get this integrated with Foreman, the future satellite system. All right. So when the user goes ahead and hits submit on this,
there are actually a number of customizations you can add to this that will interact with the CloudForms Management Engine UI. So you can set your root password, for example, using ERB, embedded Ruby, as well as the network address. You can set it to DHCP or give it a static. And those dialog boxes are in the UI, and it'll just pass it to the Kickstart. So it's
yep. So this is after the VM submission happens, there's the request queue. It's pending. In a couple of seconds, we'll actually see the VM kick off in Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization. There we go. So within a couple seconds, I'm filtering based on the broker name. The VM will boot up. It'll begin Pixie booting. And there you go, right? So it's going to actually Pixie boot, connect to satellite, build and install an OpenShift Enterprise Broker. Puppet's going to execute on it, configure the OpenShift packages correctly so that it's a broker. It's going to be registered to satellite, and there you go. All right, so the second piece is now that you've got a broker, you basically have to do the same workflow, except you want to select the node. So again, go through the workflow, select the customization template, the environment, the hardware, the network. Don't you wish you could go this fast? We would have no need for automation. All right. All right. So again, this time it's executing a different piece of Puppet code when this VM gets launched. And with a little luck, the node comes up into Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization, right? So once that's done, you can actually go ahead and how many of you remember the command from OpenShift to create an app? RHC app create, right? So basically, from here, I can go ahead and set up my server. So I'm connecting to the broker here. RHC setup. What's my broker? And from there, you could put in your name. And there you go. You could start creating applications. So just like that, self-service user can come in, provision a broker, provision a node, and start using a PaaS immediately. All right. Let me flip to the next one here. Actually, pause this.
And that kind of shows how I mentioned earlier, OpenShift doesn't care how RHEL is provided. It just wants RHEL. And so in this case, we used CloudForms Management Engine with, you could use OpenStack. You could use just straight Revs, VMware, whatever. But this makes it a fully automated from the user's point of view.
Yep. So that's that workflow. The second one is the second thing we want to show you is actually using generic catalog services. So that was virtual machine provisioning, right? But let's say I want to provision just a generic service. OpenShift actually gives you a great example of this because it's got a REST API, right? So if I wanted to, I can, those RHC command line tools, they're just calling the REST API on OpenShift, right? They're just a client tool. So if I wanted to, I can actually look at that API and create a generic service inside CloudForms Management Engine to launch the platform as a service application. So if you look at kind of the traditional view of it, right? If I'm a self-service user and I want both kind of a PaaS element and an infrastructure as a service element. Let's say I want to write something in Python and I want to connect it to Oracle. There's no cartridge for Oracle out of the box, right? With OpenShift. And if anybody could figure out how to make a cartridge for Oracle, I would. Anyway, we'll hire you. Basically, there's going to be instances where a developer wants to use things inside the infrastructure, right? So you hear a lot of people talking about DevOps and how PaaS is enabling DevOps. It's absolutely true. But name one shop that's a pure PaaS shop and doesn't have legacy infrastructure they need to drag along with that PaaS, right? A system of record along with their new cool system of engagement app written in some really fancy language. So there's no awareness and no relationship. Well, on top of that, your developer basically has to manually configure this by going to the application and then manually configuring the infrastructure, which you'd probably never let your developer even do. So he basically has to call your ops team and say, hey, I spun up my new PaaS app, but my Oracle database, I need another Oracle database to go with this. And so your DBA now has to get involved, and there's a risk of human error and all that, right? The idea here is that we want to be able to leverage CloudForms to spin up both virtual machines on the infrastructure layer and applications inside the PaaS at the same time, possibly at the same time. We're just going to launch a PaaS app in this example. So what do you need to do that? Well, you create a catalog item type of generic, and then you create a new automate method. So one of the cool things about CloudForms is it has a model inside of it that allows you to basically build any custom method that you want. And you could build an entire what's called a state machine, right? That'll manage the entire workflow. So you can create a new automate method, and then basically post-launch, you'll actually be able to see this application running in your services side. So you'll see you've launched a new OpenShift application, right? And again, this could be anything, right? This could be me launching a ticket into Remedy and then reporting the results back as a service inside of CloudForms Management Engine. So pretty powerful. And then you could even create custom buttons, to remove the items based on what types of services they are and things like that. So let me jump over here.
And the custom buttons can execute any method that you want to write. So, for example, you want to delete a VM. I know we've used that in some of our lab trainings.
Yep.
Pretty flexible and powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's, there's two catalogs, right? So remember last time we went into the operations catalog? Actually, we just provisioned a VM, right? We just went to lifecycle provision VMs. Well, I could have actually put that into a catalog, which is what I did here. So if you expand the operations catalog, you see there's now a broker and node inside the catalog. So we can even simplify that provisioning process to just an order button, right? But I've also created a development catalog in here. And so the development catalog has a number of things. You'll see Hadoop, right? That might be Hadoop running on a RHEL VM, right? When I launch that, it automatically configures Hadoop. Whereas Postgres might be a Postgres database running on RHEL as well. But what's really cool is I've got applications that are actually OpenShift applications. So I've got an OpenShift Ruby application listed in the catalog. And I could literally order that service. So when you hit order, what I've done to create this is I've created a custom service dialog, right? Inside here, it's literally point and click, add tab, add box, add text box. And then that's getting passed into the automate method, right? And the automate method then uses that information to call the REST API in OpenShift and provision the application. So it's 50 lines of Ruby, and if you're good, you could probably do it in 10. So I put in the broker, I put in the OpenShift domain. So if you're familiar with the domain concept in OpenShift, the namespaces, and then I select the application type. So in this case, I'm going to select Ruby 1.8, or I guess I can't decide, 1.9, and then put in an application name for this. And so when I hit submit, what's happening is it's executing that automate method, and you'll see that basically its pending status goes into a request queue. You can have this workflow interrupted at this point and have approvals and emails sent or remedy tickets open, if you have a favorite workflow engine. And so you'll notice when I first run RHC apps, which lists your applications, I have no applications. But then after a few seconds, this automate method's going to run. And if I run RHC apps again, I then have a OpenShift application running. And it gives me the URL and all that stuff here. And once my request is approved, I can actually go view my services. So if I go to services in my services, I can view that app running here, and I can see the URL that it's given back to me, right? So if I wanted to pull back the Git URL as well, I can do that. And there's my running OpenShift app. So PaaS app side by side with that. All right, last one. I know we stand between you and beer. This is all right. You want to talk about the compliance and control?
Sure.
Okay, cool.
So I talked earlier about policies and a little bit. There are actually multiple kinds of policies you can have. Just the control policy. So I mentioned the example of looking at SSHD config and performing a control action, which would be, this doesn't meet my condition, so I want to perform an action of shutting it down. Well, you can also have a compliance policy. So in that case, instead of just shutting it down, I could have, as an action, marked it as non-compliant. And then later on, I can come back and do a compliance check, and you basically run this policy and determine if that virtual machine is in or out of compliance, and then perform actions based on that. As an example, so what we saw here was, we used the service catalog to create. First he showed you the self-service provisioning, then he showed you this catalog method of doing it. Now you're going to actually look at a demo of using a control policy to look at an event. So I think the event is on a analysis completion, if that's right.
Yep.
Then check some of that metadata. For example, the amount of memory. And if it's not a certain threshold, then perform some action. And in this case, he sends it to automate, and he's going to use that to actually auto-scale and automatically add additional nodes.
Yep.
So
yeah, so
look at that.
Yep. So like Vinny said, so there's basically two ways you could do this. You can create a control policy for your OpenShift infrastructure, which could monitor it for certain heuristics and then scale. So those are all customizable, right? How much memory? I mean, there's thousands of fields we pull from each virtual machine as far as the data and the capacity utilization data. So you can create a control policy to this. And the second option is to actually modify the schema and automate, so that when a user comes in and actually provisions that virtual machine, it would then, post-action to that provisioning action would be go check these certain things and then perform an action separately, right? And this is actually handled with something called a state machine, which allows for like really complex workflows. So on error, on exit, on entry, those sorts of things, right? So then you can automate your methods. So basically the idea is this. Your operations user, right, he's got on his infrastructure as a service, he's running brokers and nodes, right, OpenShift brokers and nodes. And that's basically creating a platform as a service cloud. And so the apps that are running on top of there want to scale horizontally, for example. But let's say they run out of resources. That's what that exclamation point is, right? What will happen is CloudForms can determine, based on whatever metrics you want to set or thresholds you want to set, that the infrastructure, the PaaS infrastructure is saturated and needs more nodes, and it can call out to the infrastructure as a service layer, whether that's Rev, vSphere, or Amazon, and request for another node to be provisioned. And so that node can be provisioned. It will automatically join the PaaS, because CloudForms Management Engine will orchestrate that, and then it will also help you scale your apps horizontally across there. Cool? So we'll do a quick demo of that one.
While he's getting that demo ready, he talked about what a state machine is. One of the best examples of a state machine is the actual provisioning. So if you were to open up the automate, I think he shows an example here in a minute.
Yeah.
It basically, like he mentioned, there's an on entry, on exit, on error. And we saw that sort of different states when a self-service user requests a virtual machine to be provisioned, then it goes through the different states and it looks through to see if it's approved, and it's going through what's called the state machine.
Yeah, and don't take it from us. We've got, in the back, we've got Oleg and Zav. Lift your hands up. So instead of coming to us for questions at the end, you can go to them. So Zav is the product manager for CloudForms, and Oleg's the engineering manager. So definitely, if you don't trust us, you should talk to them. All right, so this is, like I said, this is the reskinned CloudForms management engine. So same UI, just a lot more red. No, they put a lot of work into it. It's a lot nicer. So the idea here is we'd like to go ahead and we've got our OpenShift Broker and Node running as VMs. And in our catalog, again, we've got an operations catalog that shows brokers and nodes that we can provision at the infrastructure layer. And we've also got, in the development catalog, we also have our applications, such as Ruby, right? All right, so what we'd like to have happen is we want to auto-scale our paths based on certain conditions. So when a user goes in and actually hits the order button here, they'll put in some information. And then based on the conditions of the paths, we want to auto-scale. So fast forward here. OK. So there's two ways you can do this. One is you can set a control policy up. So this is under the control section of CloudForms. You have control policies and compliance policies. So compliance policies will evaluate if a condition is true and report on it, right? So this is the compliance policy is like for an auditor, and a control policy is more for like an operations guy. He wants to actually take action based on whether something evaluated one way or the other. So under the VM control policies, there's a control policy called OpenShift Resource Check, and it's pretty simple. Basically, what it does is it looks at any workload that's tagged as an OpenShift node, and that can be dynamically discovered and tagged. And then when the event of a VM analysis is complete, it's going to evaluate a condition called check memory. So it's going to look if there's less than 512 megs of memory on these collection of VMs, and then it's going to run this OpenShift scale action. So that's one way you could do it. Now, I didn't actually take this way, so I'm just showing you how it can work. What I did is I actually edited the state machine to include a step inside of the provisioning process that would actually go out and check this. So you'll notice that I went up to Automate and Explore, and this is the automation engine of CloudForms management engine. This is the thing we say, don't show this to customers. No, I'm just kidding. It really is amazing how much you can do in here, right? So these are basically classes and instances and methods that are defined inside the Automate model. And this is exactly how CloudForms Management Engine does provisioning itself. So when you go to Lifecycle and provision VMs, it's actually using this same Automate model, which is pretty powerful. So basically what I've done is I've created a custom method called Create OpenShift Application, and I've created one called Scale OpenShift. I got a pointer or no? No, that's okay. Oh, perfect. So I've created Create OpenShift Application, and you'll notice that basically there is a provisioning step inside this state machine. So the workflow goes from top to bottom, right? And the provisioning step is provision OpenShift Application. And then after it does that, there's a post step that says also check if you should scale OpenShift. And so what that method does is it simply connects to the OpenShift broker and says how many apps are running on this broker. If it exceeds a certain threshold, which yes, it's hard-coded because I wrote it, will actually then spin up a node for that. So let's go ahead and kick through this. So what will happen is the user will hit order, just like you saw before, right? He's going to go ahead and provision an application. So you'll notice that the application provision started. At the same time, once that application gets provisioned, the post-provisioning step is going to start. So you'll also notice that it's booting a VM from network right after that, right? So it actually ran the service provisioning task, and then the post-provision analyzed how many apps were running on the paths and said, yes, we need another VM that's a node. And you'll see that the state of this VM is it's booting. The CPU's all pegged because it's PXE booting right now. And so that VM is actually getting installed an OpenShift node deployed on it. And so you'll see the IP addresses here. You got 199 is the broker, 191 is the node, and I think it's 180 is the other node that comes up, right? So after time, obviously there was some time lapse, some special effects, all right? But you got your nodes back up, and you'll notice it also showed up right in CloudForms Management Engine. So it automated the deployment of the PaaS nodes based on the load. And then what I also have available is if I go down to my OpenShift Broker and run the OO stats command, which is the OpenShift origin stats command, and grep for the node count, you'll see that the node count actually went up to 2 nodes, I think, now, right? So my node count just increased by 1. So I think that is about it. Yeah, and that's the mcollective ping as well. So let me do this.
So that's it. So just in summary and wrap up, we talked about, we gave you a quick overview of OpenShift as well as CloudForms Management Engine. We talked about some of our best practices for deploying CloudForms. And then we looked at taking that deployment and extending your architecture to cover multiple zones and then eventually multiple regions, and how to replicate those databases up to a master database. Then we looked at care and feeding of your environment. We talked about backing up those databases and exporting your models and your policies. And then James went through examples of doing provisioning, and in this case, provisioning OpenShift, brokers and nodes. And then we looked at taking that a step further and making that fully automated and basically have a user select an order button and be able to have that very easily, very quickly. And then lastly, looked at extending that to using an automate model to look at the environment and auto-scale. So my name is Vinny Valdez. One thing we would like to ask you is please fill out the survey, be honest, and remember that we're letting you go to have beer, so be very nice to us.